Again, if you have a Bible, if you want to turn to 1 Samuel chapter 18. We're going to read the whole of chapter 18 and then just into chapter 19. Before we do, we'll get our bearings on the story. The book of 1 Samuel starts, as Ruth has reminded us, with Samuel, the calling of Samuel. And Samuel is this transition. He's kind of the last of the judges, and he hands over to the first of the kings of Israel. The nation of Israel decide that they want to be like all the other nations around and about. They want a king, a man at the front of the army who's going to lead them out to battle. And God tells us that this is Israel rejecting him and wanting a king like the nations. And Saul is this first king that's appointed. Initially, things seem to be going well with King Saul. He leads the people into victory over the Philistines. And things seem to be going well, but then quickly Saul becomes proud. His crown becomes more about him and what people think of him than it is about him kind of ruling under God. And so Saul becomes proud. In a way, he's a little bit like Adam. Adam, we were thinking about in 1 Corinthians 15, he's like the king. He's the first king, Adam. He's in the garden. He's to have dominion and rule. And we don't know how long, but after some time, he grasps to be like God. That's what the whole taking of the fruit is. Adam and Eve, they want to be like God. They grasp to be great. It becomes all about them, and then we have the great fall. And Saul, his life quickly begins to unravel as he grasps for glory for himself. God brings a message to him by the lips of Samuel. God says that the kingdom is going to be torn away from King Saul, and it's going to be given to a neighbour who's better than him. And is often the case with God's words. That doesn't happen overnight. So Saul gets this message from Samuel, and it's years and years and years and years before Saul actually loses his kingship, but it comes to pass. What we have in chapter 17 of 1 Samuel is that great chapter of David and Goliath. David's just been anointed to be the next king in this small private ceremony, and the next chapter is David killing Goliath. He strides out in weakness with a sling and a staff, and he conquers the great giant Goliath. Goliath has been terrorizing the Israelites, and David really steps up and does what the king should do. David delivers God's people. Our passage today begins with David. He's kind of giant's head in hand, and he comes to Saul's tent. Saul says, "Get the boy and bring him here." And that's where we pick up. So 18 verse 1. As soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the son of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David. And Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David, and his armour, and even his sword, and his bow, and his belt. And David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul set him over the men of war. And this was good in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. As they were coming home, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines and with songs of joy and with musical instruments. And the women sang to one another as they celebrated. Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him, and he said, "They've ascribed to David tens of thousands, and to me they've ascribed thousands. And what more can he have but the kingdom?" And Saul eyed David from that day on. The next day a harmful spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved within his house while David was playing the lyre, as he did day by day. Saul had his spear in his hand, and Saul heard the spear, for he thought, "I will pin David to the wall." But David eluded him twice. And Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. So Saul removed him from his presence and made him commander of 1,000, and he went out and came in before the people. And David had success in all his undertakings, for the Lord was with him. And when Saul saw that he had great success, he stood in fearful awe of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, for he went out and came in before them. Then Saul said to David, "Here is my elder daughter Merab. I will give her to you for a wife. Only be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battles." For Saul thought, "Let not my hand be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him." And David said to Saul, "Who am I and who are my relatives and my father's clan in Israel that I should be son-in-law to the king?" But at the time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, she was given to Adriel the Metholite for a wife. Now Saul's daughter Michal loved David, and they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. And Saul thought, "Let me give her to him, that she may be a snare for him, that the hand of the Philistines may be against him." Therefore Saul said to David a second time, "You shall now be my son-in-law." And Saul commanded his servants, "Speak to David in private and say, 'Behold, the king has delight in you, and all his servants love you. Now then, become the king's son-in-law.'" And Saul's servants spoke these words in the ears of David, and David said, "Does it seem to you a little thing to become the king's son-in-law, since I am a poor man and have no reputation?" And the servants of Saul told him, "Thus and so did David speak." And then Saul said, "Thus shall you say to David, 'The king desires no bride price except 100 foreskins of the Philistines, that he may be avenged of the king's enemies.'" Now Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines, and when his servants told David these words, it pleased David well to be the king's son-in-law. And before the time had expired, David arose and went along with his men and killed 200 of the Philistines. And David brought their foreskins, which were given in full number to the king, that he might be the king's son-in-law. And Saul gave him his daughter Michal for a wife. And when Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him, Saul was even more afraid of David. So Saul was David's enemy continually. Then the commanders of the Philistines came out to battle, and as often as they came out, David had more success than all the servants of Saul, so that his name was highly esteemed. And Saul spoke to Jonathan, his son, and to all his servants that they should kill David. But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted much in David, and Jonathan told David, "Saul, my father, seeks to kill you, therefore be on guard in the morning. Stay in a secret place and hide yourself, and I will go out and stand beside my father in the field where you are. And I will speak to my father about you, and if I learn anything, I will tell you." And Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul, his father, and said to him, "Let not the king sin against his servant David, because he's not sinned against you, and because his deeds have brought good to you. For he took his life in his hand, and he struck down the Philistine, and the Lord worked a great salvation for all Israel. You saw it and rejoiced. Why then will you sin against innocent blood by killing David without cause?" That's our passage for today. Quite a long passage, but I've got a lot out of it, and I've looked at it. I haven't watched many Western films. I don't know if there's any Western film fans here, but the climax of Western films, or as I imagine it, is two men, kind of pistols at dawn. Usually the two most prominent figures in the film, and they're stood there, and then you get this classic line, "This town ain't big enough for the two of us." That's like the classic Western line, isn't it? Usually what's happened is, as these people, there's been frictions in the town. These two key figures there's been sparks and fireworks, and they've grown apart, and it's become increasingly antagonistic and violent. And usually there's like a saloon brawl, and there's often a kind of a subplot, a love interest with maybe the sheriff's daughter. But it starts off small and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and it ends at the pistols at dawn because this town ain't big enough for the two of us. That's a little bit like what we see in 1 Samuel 18. that's the very beginnings. David has killed the Goliath, and Saul, his jealousy begins. And what we see from chapter 18 onwards is this kind of increase in hostility from Saul towards David, because he recognises that it's him or David. There can't be two big guns in town. It's him or David. And as far as Saul is concerned, David has to go. As we think about this story, just going to 3 headings to kind of navigate the way. The first heading is just getting the story clear. So getting this story clear, the details. The next heading is going to be getting this story in the big story. So getting the big story clear. And then we're going to think about getting personal. So what does this story mean for us this morning? So first of all, getting this story clear. I think as I've read this story, there's 2 big points in this story. These stories are always multi-layered. They're always jam-packed with a depth and a richness that is hard to get to the bottom of. But I think there's 2 big points in this. The first point is that God's favour is glaringly obvious. I think that's what the writer wants us to understand here, that God's favour is glaringly obvious. So we know that David has been anointed to be the next king, but no one else really knows that at this point. But God here is making his favour glaringly obvious. So we read about David 4 times that he's successful. Successful. David just has success written all over him. He's like got the Midas touch. Everything he touches turns to gold. It seems like almost that David could go out into battle with a feather duster and he could come back victorious. He just has victory. He goes in and out. The people love it. They just lead. He leads them into victory. He's so successful. When you play football, there's often someone in a team who we call a talisman. And you're sat in the changing room, you look around, you're always glad that person's there. Because you know that when they're there, things are going to go well. Most teams have one. A player who's there, he's like the talisman, and he leads people into victory. And that's like David. He's the talisman of the Israelite army. When he's there, victory is assured. And he's just so successful. And we read in verse 14 why David is so successful. So verse 14 says this, "And David had success in all his undertakings, for the Lord was with him." That's why David's successful, because the Lord is with him. And everyone else sees this success, and everyone else just loves it. So you read six times that people love David. So first of all, Jonathan, he loves David. He looks on. He's probably had a front row seat at the David and Goliath show, and he looks on, and we read that his soul is knit to David. He loves David as his own soul. That's the prince. Then the local singers, they love David, don't they? They sing this song about Saul's killed thousands, but David is tens of thousands. The local singers love him. The king's attendants love him. Everyone in the king's court, David's like the celebrity. Everyone's talking about him. We read that all of Israel and Judah love him. And then at the end, we read that even Princess Michal, or Michael, or whatever you want to call her, she has a poster on a wall of David. She loves David. Everybody loves David. Well, almost everybody, isn't it? Because not Saul. So we don't read about Saul. Saul doesn't love David. In fact, we don't hear much about what Saul thinks of David until later on, when we actually realise that Saul is plotting to kill David. I'm sure Saul was glad to be rid of Goliath, the giant. I'm sure Saul was glad to have the victories in the battle. But we read that even from the beginning of the chapter, Saul has kind of an eye on David. He knows David is a threat. He doesn't like this guy. He's probably thinking about Samuel's words to him that the kingdom, Saul's been torn from you and it's been given to another, a neighbour of yours who's better than you. And probably from that day on, Saul's had his eye out. He's looking around, who is this neighbour? And then up rises David, this guy with success after success. He doesn't love David. So that's the first thing. God makes his favour glaringly obvious. Everybody knows there's something special about David. The second thing to note from this story is that Saul's self-preservation is foolish. Saul's self-preservation is just really foolish. The tensions start as they set off home. There's this victory parade from the the killing of Goliath. Everyone's happy, there's a great victory, and everyone's coming out as they would have done before to welcome the army home. The women are out on the street and they're singing the songs, and Saul hears one of these songs, and the words, we read them, Saul has killed thousands and David his tens of thousands. It's not really an anti-Saul song. Saul's killed his thousands, but it's definitely a pro-David song, isn't it? It's pro-David, he's killed his tens of thousands. And Saul hears this, and we might at first think he's a bit paranoid, because Saul hears the song, and then the next minute he says, what's going to happen? David's going to get my kingdom. It seems a big jump, doesn't it, from a little ditty in the street to David having his kingdom. But Saul knows the power of words. We're in an election at the minute, aren't we? And our politicians know the power of words. You hear lots of phrases over and over again. Strong and stable Britain, for the many, not the few. All these phrases, and you get repeated and repeated and repeated. And Saul knows if this song is allowed to go on, it won't be long before David has the kingdom. And Saul hates David for it. Saul, we will see already in 1 Samuel, it's about him, it's about his glory. And Saul hates sharing his glory. He hates playing second fiddle. Remember, Saul is a bit like Adam. He grasps for glory. He wants to be like God. And there is a sense in that we're all a little like Saul. We all like us sharing the glory. We all like life to be about us. None of us really likes that John the Baptist role. You know, he must increase, I must decrease. That doesn't really come naturally to us. So we can maybe empathise with Saul a little bit. His jealousy kicks in, and he thinks, I must keep my eye on this lad, David. And after the great homecoming, Saul is in his palace, and he has these episodes. He's been having them for a couple of chapters now, these episodes where this spirit, an evil spirit it's called, or a troubling spirit, it comes upon him and he seems to rave and rant. And before now, David's been brought in to play his harp and calm the king down. But now, obviously, David, he's lost his therapeutic effect. He plays his harp and Saul picks his spear up and tries to pin him to the wall. And twice we read that Saul tries to kill David. It's his self-preservation. That doesn't work. He thinks he best try a little bit of a more covert way to get the job done. He thinks, hold on, if I marry David off to one of my daughters, he's kind of obliged to fight my battles. I'll send him out to fight the Philistines often, and, you know, it's chance. Eventually, David is going to fall by the hand of the Philistines. If he fights for long enough, he's going to fall. And then for some reason, I don't know why, this daughter, Merab, he gives him to someone else, and David doesn't get married. And then a little bit later, Saul hears that Michal loves David. And we read that this pleases Saul. He thinks, oh, I'll get another go. We'll marry him off to Michal, and things will be okay. He'll fight the Philistines and he'll fall, and then he's eliminated. Saul, what you see is he just begins to manipulate everyone and everything to try and save himself. Even his own daughter, he's not really thinking about her at her wedding and whether David will be a great husband for her. He's just thinking about, getting David killed. Everything becomes manipulated and about Saul and his glory. Saul has this plan, doesn't he? It's pretty gory. He says, David, I don't want a bride price. Don't pay me loads of money. Just go and kill 100 Philistines and bring the foreskins back for me to prove you've done the job. He thinks, surely David's got to kill. If he's got to kill 100 Philistines, surely he's going to fall in battle. And we read that David brings back 200 foreskins before the allotted time. He has a deadline. He does the job before the deadline, and they count them out. It's all pretty gory. And then David becomes the king's son-in-law. The king's son-in-law. And all these attempts Saul makes to eliminate David, to save himself, to preserve himself. And it's just foolish, because deep down I think Saul knows that he's fighting a losing battle. He knows that David is the next king. We read that of Saul that he doesn't love David, but 3 times we read that he fears David. He's desperately afraid of David. So verse 12 says, Saul is afraid because the Lord was with David and had departed from Saul. Saul's self-preservation is so foolish because he's not only fighting against David, he's fighting against God. He knows God has left him and he knows God is with David. It's obvious. And yet he fights against God. And like we said, he's manipulating everyone in every situation to his own ends, trying to preserve his own crown. And it's sad to see Saul's life unravel really through the rest of the book of 1 Samuel. And as we get to the end, Saul is on the battlefield. He's mortally wounded by a Philistine arrow. The Philistines that David just had endless success against. And the situation is so bad that Saul decides to fall on his own sword. He commits suicide on the battlefield. His self-preservation is so foolish. We read that Psalm 2 earlier. And it's all about God's king. And I don't know if this psalm was around when Saul was alive. Let me find Psalm 2. But I think Saul would have found it instructive, wouldn't he? Why do the nations rage? The peoples plot in vain. The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel against the Lord and against his anointed. We read in 4-6 that God laughs at them, that he's set his king in Zion on my holy hill. He gives a warning that the kings of the earth would be wise, that they would kiss the Son, that they would take refuge in God's chosen king. They would have been wise words for Saul to hear, wouldn't they? As he looked on and saw that David was obviously favoured by God. And yet, if we're thinking about getting the big story straight, the big story of the Bible, Psalm 2 isn't about David. Psalm 2 is about Jesus, isn't it? Ultimately, Psalm 2 is about Jesus. Jesus is God's anointed king. He's the one who sits on David's throne forever. He's the one, the forever king of a kingdom, not just a Middle Eastern kingdom in Israel, but he's the king of the cosmos. He's the forever king. And Jesus, when he was in this world, he was speaking to the Pharisees, the religious leaders at the time. And he was speaking about the Old Testament scriptures. And they were debating this. And Jesus said to them, "You search the scriptures because you think that in them you will have eternal life." But he says, those scriptures bear witness about me, and you will not come to me so that you have life. So Jesus makes this claim about the Old Testament. The Old Testament, the scriptures, is ultimately about him. They speak about him and the eternal life that is found in Jesus. The blessing that is found for all who take refuge in him. And as with 1 Samuel 18, so it is with Jesus. God makes his favour obvious, glaringly obvious in the life of Jesus. It's obvious that Jesus is God's chosen king, not of Israel, but of the cosmos. That's clear as we read the Gospels. So in the narrative account to Mary, the angel says, "He will be great, he will be called the Son of the Most High, he will reign on David's throne forever, and of his kingdom there shall be no end." And then as a child, we read that Jesus grows in wisdom and in stature and in favour with God and men. At his baptism, there's this great voice from heaven. The Spirit comes down in the form of a dove, and there's this voice from heaven that says, "You are my Son, whom I love. With you I am well pleased." And then we see in the Gospels, everyone, well, almost everyone loves Jesus. The crowds, they flock to him. He does things that no one else can do. He heals people. He raises people back to life. He casts out demons. Everyone loves Jesus. They flock to him. He's obviously favoured. He's God's chosen king. And then the transfiguration. You have the inner three. They're on the mountain, and then Jesus is there, and suddenly Elijah and Moses are there, and Jesus is transfigured. His robes become bright and white and shining. And again, the voice says, "This is my Son whom I have chosen. Listen to him." So God is making clear Jesus is the chosen one. He's the favored one. He's my king. And then probably the most obvious is the resurrection. That is God's demonstration to the world of who Jesus is. He is the resurrection. In Romans it says that the resurrection is God's declaration to the world that this is my son. This is my king. That's what the resurrection is all about. And that event separates our whole world in two. Our history is in two by that event. That's God's big finger pointing to say, this is my son, my chosen king. And just like David in 1 Samuel 18, Jesus also faces opposition. Really foolish, self-preserving opposition. So it comes in the form mainly of the Pharisees, the religious leaders, and the authorities. They oppose Jesus. They push back against him. They seek to destroy him. Jesus threatens their position and their power. You read in John, just before Jesus is at Lazarus' house and gets his feet anointed, the woman breaking the alabaster flask. Just before that, we read that the Pharisees are plotting because if they realize if they don't take Jesus out, they are going to lose their place and their nation. It's self-preservation. They kick against God's king. And ultimately, they hang him upon the cross, but God raises him back to life. And that opposition against God's king and God's kingdom continues still today. We see that. Those of you who get the Open Doors magazine, you will see that in the prayer journal there, the opposition that goes on against the Lord and against his anointed. Even today, people kick against God's anointed king. When Saul's on the road to Damascus, not King Saul, but Saul Paul, he's on the road to Damascus, Jesus comes to him and says, Paul, why are you persecuting not the church, but me? Me, when the church is persecuted, Jesus, the king, is persecuted. This is still the story that's going on in our world today. And if we choose to align with King Jesus, we will face the persecution, the opposition. We see that in 1 Samuel 18, Jonathan, he kind of sides with David. And it's not long before King Saul is throwing spears at Jonathan, his own son, because he's aligned himself with King David. And if we align ourselves with King Jesus, we too will face opposition. So that's the big story, that God has made his favour glaringly obvious. Jesus is his chosen one. And even in the life of Jesus and continuing on, we see opposition still to God's chosen king. But what about us today? How does this all affect us? David, he's the king, isn't he, over Israel, but it was for a time. Jesus, he's the king over the cosmos, and his kingdom will never end. And these stories, they're like a mirror to us. The Bible is like a mirror to us. And I think much of it comes as a story. And the stories, they're great stories to kind of dive into and immerse yourself into. But I think we have so much story in the Bible because it's much easier to see somebody else's foolishness than it is your own. Isn't it? It's much easier to see someone else's foolishness. I find that. It's much easier to see other people's foolishness than it is your own. And we have these stories here so that we can see Saul's foolishness. We can see his foolish self-preservation. As you read through the 1 Samuel narrative, you look at Saul and you want to shake him. Saul, wake up. What are you doing, Saul? This isn't going to end well. You can just see the path that he's taking. And you want to shake him. Wake up, Saul. Don't you see it? You're fighting against David. He's the anointed king. You're fighting against God. This cannot end well. And then you realise, you look in the mirror. You realise, actually, it's not about Saul and David, but it's about you and Jesus. It's about me and Jesus. And fighting against God's anointed is foolish. To oppose Jesus does not end well. To oppose God's chosen king does not end well. It's the equivalent of falling on your own sword. It's the equivalent of signing your own death warrant. It's walking the highway to hell. It's embracing your own condemnation. That's what you do when you push Jesus off to the side. We see it in Saul. want to read just a couple of verses from John's Gospel. So John 3:16 is probably the best known verse in the Bible, isn't it? 17 and 18 maybe aren't as well known. But they say this: "For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that in order that the world might be saved through him. Whoever believes in him is not condemned, but whoever does not believe in him is condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of the only Son of God." They're sobering words, aren't they? And we have this story this morning. We're looking at this story this morning, and it calls us away from self-preserving foolishness. It calls us away from thinking we can keep the crown on our own head and everything will be okay. Because it is utterly foolish. How should we respond to King Jesus? The words of Psalm 2 say, "Kiss the Son, take refuge in him." What does that mean? I think we have a great example in Jonathan, in his actions towards David. Jonathan, he's the son of Saul. He's the next king. He's the prince. He will be the next king. He's probably already been prepared. He's had his lessons in how to be a king. His whole character, his whole identity has been shaped by being the prince. He's expecting to be the next king. And you would think that knowing that, Jonathan would also be on the plan to kill David, because David's not only a threat to Saul, he's also a threat to Jonathan's crown, because Jonathan is the one who should take the crown next. And Jonathan, no doubt he's seen David in battle. He's seen his strength, he's recognised his success. And yet, Jonathan isn't plotting David's downfall, is he? Anything but. We read there at the start of 18 that Jonathan loved David as his own soul. And then these startling verses that Jonathan, straight after the battle with Goliath, he comes and he takes off his kind of royal robe, his sword, his shield, his spear, his belt, everything, and he just puts it at David's feet. It's almost like his whole identity as king, and he just comes and lays that down at David's feet. It's almost there, he's acknowledging, looking on and seeing just how good David has been in the battle against Goliath. He recognises that David is one favoured by God. He just comes and lays down his kingship at David's feet. He just submits to him. It's startling, isn't it? All those years and all those plans he had to be the king, and in a moment they are just laid down at David's feet. That's the call to us this morning, to lay down our crowns. We like to think we call the shots, that our life is all about us, but the Bible tells us that our lives are all about Jesus. He's the king, and the call is to come to him, to lay down our crowns, and to own him as our king. As I read this account, it just got me thinking, like, why does Jonathan do this? What is going through Jonathan's head to make him do this? This kind of is massive for Jonathan. What makes him surrender his place? The writer leaves us hanging a bit, but at the start of 19 there, when Jonathan is speaking with his father Saul about David, we get a little bit of an insight into what's going on in Jonathan's mind to make him do this. So verse 5, this is Jonathan's account of the David and Goliath scene. He would have looked on. He would have known probably if anyone's going to fight Goliath, it should be Saul, or it should be him as the prince. And he's scared, and Saul's scared, and all Israel is scared. And he watches as David steps up and strikes down this giant Philistine. And this is what he says in verse 5 of chapter 19. "For David took his life in his hand, and he struck down the Philistine. The Lord worked a great salvation for all Israel. You saw it and rejoiced. Why then will you sin against innocent blood by killing David without cause?" Jonathan looks on and sees that David is the one who can bring victory. David is the one who is the successful one. And rather than fighting against David and his anointed kingship, Jonathan decides, you know what? I'm going to lay down my crown and I'm just going to side with David. I'm going to share in the victory that David brings, and I'm going to bring my tribute to him. That's what Jonathan decides. He's seen in David that he takes his life in his hands. He steps out, risking his life on the battlefield. He fights Goliath and defeats him. And for Jonathan, that wins his heart. That wins his heart. And it's no different when it comes to Jesus, is it? Jesus fought a battle that we can never, ever win. When we think about Goliath, sometimes we hear, oh, Goliath, he's your financial problem. You can overcome him if you trust God. He's this circumstance that you can't get past. If you trust God, you will conquer. But Goliath, he's an unconquerable foe. Goliath is sin and Satan and death. The foes that we cannot conquer, the foes that just leave us shaking and impotent. We can't do anything to defeat sin and Satan and death. And yet into our place steps Jesus. Steps out in weakness at the cross. He's scorned and mocked. And when he dies, it looks like he's failed. But 3 days later, he's raised to life and he conquers sin and Satan and death on our behalf. And we don't lift a finger. We're like the Israelites. We're shaking on the hillside. We don't lift a finger, and yet we get to share in his victory. Jesus turns our fear into joy. That's what will capture our hearts. When we realize just what Jesus has done for us in defeating these enemies that we just cannot defeat, then we will say, Jesus, you're my king. I want to follow you. I want to give you my all. I wonder this morning, what's your response to King Jesus? Are you trying to preserve your own kingship? Are you trying to keep the crown on your head and pushing Jesus off to the side? Let's learn from Saul. This really isn't going to end well. It doesn't end well. Or are we going to come like Jonathan and embrace the king? Are we going to share in his victory? Are we going to lay our crown at his feet and say, Jesus, my life is all about you? That's not a one-off decision. That's a choice that we make day after day after day, to recognize that Jesus is king. The world out there would tell us a different story about what life is all about. But actually, life is all about King Jesus. We'll finish with some words again from Jesus. Luke chapter 9 says this. Jesus is speaking to his disciples. He says, "Whoever would save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake will save it." They describe the words of 1 Samuel 18. Saul tries to keep his life, to keep his crown, he loses it. The call for us is to lose our life to Jesus that we may save it. So let's this morning see the foolishness of a stubborn self-preservation. Let's turn away from that and just turn to King Jesus, bring tribute to him, the one who loved us and gave himself for us. Shall we just pray and then we'll sing our final song?